Hi students, it's Dr. Marks, and my goal here is to give you a quick introduction to the idea of selection bias. Now, in this module, we've been discussing data, and our study is only as good as our data. If we have bad data, then our conclusions are going to be impacted, plain and simple. So that's going to make our conclusions unreliable. Somebody's going to simply say this is a bad study, and they're going to point to the data problems at hand. One important issue is selection bias, and this is going to come up in our class in more than one place, but highly relevant here. Now, we collect samples to learn about populations. We've already introduced that idea. Maybe we want to survey residents of the United States, and our goal is to learn about attitudes related to current policy. Maybe we're talking about affirmative action that just happens to be something going on right now as I record this. So we want to use a survey. We're reaching out to United States residents, and we want to learn about opinions on affirmative action. But we cannot survey everyone, right? That would be impossible. So what do? We take a sample. Well, if we want to learn about a population, then our sample needs to reflect that population, right? So samples are used to learn about populations. But what if our sample is not representative? What if we collect a bunch of data from people, but it's from a sample that doesn't look like the population of the United States? Well, then we have selection bias, and this is going to be a problem. It might be due to carelessness on the part of researchers. So probably not intentional. They weren't necessarily trying to be manipulative, but a good researcher is going to be thinking about selection bias and taking measures to avoid a selection bias problem. For example, let's say we want to evaluate attitudes about a policy promoted by President Biden. Maybe we're talking about his attempt to try to eliminate student loans. All right, well, that was a very hotly debated topic. Not everyone agreed. But what if we mainly survey Democrats? We throw a survey out there and 90% of our respondents are Democrats. Well, clearly that is selection bias, right? It doesn't reflect the population of the United States, right? Our population isn't 90% Democrats. We've got a lot of people with very different views associated with the Republican Party. So that's going to be a problem, and it's going to give us inaccurate conclusions. When we say things like our survey results show that 75% of survey respondents support this move to eliminate student debt. Well, that's going to be an inaccurate conclusion because it was based on a survey that generated a sample that involved selection bias. So researchers need to have thought through how to collect a sample. When you're collecting samples, you need to give thought to what do. You want to make sure that you are representing the population. In this case, this would be a very bad study. A second example, let's say we want to recruit participants for a health study, and we're going to stand outside of a free health clinic to do this. So I'm going to stand outside of that free health clinic. Clearly, when we think about free health clinics, usually those are means tested, and they're only going to give health care to people that are lower income. So we're looking at a particular group of people, a particular demographic, and that's fine, but might be problematic for our study. So let's say we stand there and we're going to recruit a lot of people from this approach. It might be highly successful for getting people to agree to participate in this health study. But here's the problem. The fact that these people are going to a health clinic suggests that they were seeking medical attention. All right, that might make them different than, for example, those people not seeking medical attention. Well, I've just ignored a lot of people that might have different behaviors, that might have different health outcomes. So we're not representing everybody, we're just representing people who have a medical condition and they're seeking treatment for it. Also, if this is a free clinic, then we might be focusing on just one demographic, right? Is the population of interest to us lower income individuals who are seeking health care? Because that's a pretty narrowly defined population. If that's not our population of interest, lower income individuals who are actively seeking health care, well then we have selection bias, right? If we care about across incomes, wanting to cast a wider net, if that's our interest in terms of our population, we have not achieved that with our sample, right? So Survey data can clearly be subject to selection bias, and I just gave you an example where we're recruiting maybe experimental subjects, and that can also be subject to selection bias. But survey data definitely can be, especially when relying on volunteers. In other words, if you're just relying on volunteers to complete a survey, selection bias can be an issue because some people may be more inclined to respond to that survey. And if some groups are more inclined to respond, then we have overrepresentation of certain groups. That's going to be a problem. For example, in my last example, let's say we are administering a local survey about planned facilities for youth recreation in our county. All right, well, who comes to mind here? Most likely important to people with kids, since we're talking about youth recreation. That means people with kids might be more likely to answer the survey. Okay, now if that's what you want, if you want to know the attitudes of people with kids, this might not be a problem. But maybe you want responses from a representative set of taxpayers. After all, if this is going to be public facilities paid for by the county, this is going to use taxpayer money. Maybe we want to know how other people feel about it, people without children, for example. But we might not likely get that part of the population without some effort, right? So selection bias clearly could be an issue here. So in conclusion, data quality is important in a study. We understand that. And selection bias is one thing that researchers must keep in mind when they're designing a study, they're collecting data, and they're thinking about their data sets. This topic will come up again, but I wanted to introduce it now since we will use a little bit of this idea as we progress. So be looking for more on the topic of selection bias. Let me know if you have any questions, and thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.